if you look at other animals are perfectly designed to consume the diets that they consume, whether it's the production of enzymes or different organs or pieces and parts of their digestive tract or the way their palate is formed or the shape of their teeth. They are perfectly designed to take a certain set of resources from the environment and safely and efficiently transform that into nutrition and to fuel their bodies. Humans don't have that. In fact, when we started creating tools, something really, really weird happened. Our bodies and brains jumped in size. And both of those things require a massive influx of high-quality nutrition to fuel. A bigger body requires more nutrition and better nutrition. And more importantly, a bigger brain requires more and better nutrition as well. You would expect that as our bodies and our brains grew, every part of our anatomy that we have that allows us to take a raw material and transform it into its safest and most nourishing form should also get bigger or more efficient as well. And what we see is the exact opposite.
All right, guys. Well, today's show with Dr. Bill Schindler is brought to you by Bioscience Nutrition. We're talking a lot about various nutrients found in an omnivorous, whole food style diet. One of my favorite nutrients to remind you about the importance of is creatine. Creatine is everywhere now. Many people are taking it, but did you know that most creatine products on the market are actually sourcing raw materials made in China? But what makes Bioscience unique is you're getting European-derived creatine, known as CreaPure, made in Germany, arguably the purest creatine product on the market, paired with electrolytes, because in order to get creatine into your brain, into your heart, into your skeletal muscle, you need electrolytes. It used to be thought that you need glucose and you need sugar. That's why in the late 90s, if you were like me, you took creatine, in high school and so forth, it was paired with dextrose, but that is not needed. You actually need electrolytes to optimize the absorption and utilization of creatine. But it turns out that creatine helps electrolytes too, because it helps draw water into your skeletal muscles. So as the days get longer and it gets warmer out as we approach spring and summer, it's important to pair creatine with electrolytes around exercise. You can optimize your athletic performance as well as support healthy hydration. You can see what over 1,800 people are saying about the electrolyte sticks featuring 2.5 grams of CreaPure creatine monohydrate paired with electrolytes like magnesium, real salt, potassium, taurine, and beyond over at myoscience.com. Again, there's 1,800 reviews. See what other people are saying. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and you can save with the code podcast at checkout. So let's get back to it with Dr. Bill Schindler.
Bill, it's great to be with you.
It's great to be here.
An amazing time learning so much about fermentation, sourdough, and just eating traditional foods. I really want to get into the weeds on a lot of different aspects about preparing food healthily to minimize the plant toxins, which it turns out is a major focal point of your professional life, has been looking at. Maybe if you could explain sort of the archaeological way that you got into food, I think that would really help set the stage for what you're doing here at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me.
Yes.
I'm thrilled to share this information with your audience. My focus in archaeology, I've always been interested in things that are old. I never even knew how old things could be. So in my small little world, in middle school, my father and I used to read all the biographies of the mountain men, the fur trappers like Jim Bridger and Hugh Glass and those guys, and I thought that was old. I loved it, the nostalgic, the connection of what I thought was that they were so connected to their environment. And then I was a history major as an undergraduate, and a history major and a secondary education double major. And I started teaching high school, and I loved it. I finally graduated college, and now I'm teaching what I love. And I've realized two things at first year teaching high school history. One was that I loved teaching, and teaching high school history was close, but not exactly it. So I decided, I told Christine, I'm going back to school. I'm going to be an archaeologist, and I'm going to teach college. And she's like, you're out of your mind. It took you 10 years to get your undergrad. This isn't going to happen. Anyhow, that's the direction that I took. And the focus of it, I always loved doing things with my hands. My father always had me hunting, fishing, trapping, working with wood in the garage, that sort of thing. At the time I was making bows. And I realized that the thing that I wanted to connect with most from the archaeological record was how tools were made and what they could be used for. So the branch of archaeology that I was focusing on was something called experimental archaeology. So in addition to regular field archaeology and excavating, I was doing all those things, but my focus, the people that I was learning from, the things I was spending most of my time on, was learning how to recreate ancestral technologies, how to make tools and how to use tools from the past. And I don't mean like 500 years ago. I'm talking about some cases millions of years ago. And it was amazing. I sought out some of the best tool makers in the world. Believe it or not, there are people that do these things. And I became skilled in a lot of these different areas. And I started teaching it, which was great. At the same time, and it's incredibly unhealthy relationship with food. My own health was in the toilet. It was horrible. I kept trying all the new diets. I did South Beach. I did all of them, and none of them really resonated with me or solved the issues that I was looking to solve. And at the same time, I had just started a family. Christina had gotten married, and we started having kids. So it was more. It wasn't just about my health now. It was about how do I feed my wife? How do I feed my kids? And nothing made sense until I made the connection that, first the connection that not only did our ancestral dietary past over several million years build us as humans, literally create us as humans. We are here now with the ability to see one another, speak, create microphones, broadcast this conversation widely because of this incredible transformative dietary change that supported massive body and brain growth. And what I thought was so transformative for me in my own journey was to recognize that the technologies that transformed our food ways was so closely linked to our changing diets, and then again, our evolutionary past to create humans. So it wasn't just, hey, now we're eating meat. It's, hey, what are we doing? How are we using tools to take a raw material from the environment that we actually have no business as humans eating? Our digestive tract is not designed to eat almost every food that we eat. How do we create a tool to make that raw material as safe, nutrient-dense, as bioavailable as possible? And that is the nut that our ancestors cracked and continued to improve upon. And because they did that, our diets created such an incredible influx of high-quality, safe nutrition that it supported massive body and brain growth, and we're here having this conversation. So the reality is that the decades of work I was doing, learning how to make stone tools and learning how to make fire and learning how to ferment, doing all those is exactly the path that was and eventually led to answering my own health questions, putting me on a track to, right now I'm 52 years old, I'm enjoying the best health I ever have in my entire life, and that includes being a Division I athlete. Right now, I'm in better health now than I was in my 20s as a Division I athlete. Because of that journey. So when somebody asks me a question about food, if somebody asks a doctor about food or diet or health, they probably go back to something they learned in medical school or something from a medical journal in order to answer that question, and that's fine. When somebody asks me a question about food or diet or health, I go back to the archaeological record. I say, okay, how were we eating? How does this make sense in a prehistoric context? And then what does that mean as a foundation for answering that question for today?
Love that. And what percentage of the tools were developed to make food more accessible to us? You shared with me a number. Majority of the tools, or super majority of the tools, worked for early ancestral tools, if you will, that you've been studying, where it was all about food, right?
Every one of them. Like, I do not know of an ancestral technology that didn't have something to do with food in some way. Either getting food, processing food, storing food, preparing food, sharing food. I mean, all of it at some level had something to do with that. And somebody listening to this might say, oh my gosh, you're talking about people banging rocks in the past. Yeah, simple technologies, but transformative, powerful. So let me give you an example. The oldest technology that we've been able to identify in the archaeological record is something called the Lemekwe tool. It was found just west of Lake Turkana in Kenya, and it dates to 3.3 million years ago. It's a tool I showed you yesterday. And the production of that tool takes less than a second. If you have the right rock and you hit it at the right angle, you will produce a flake or a sharp edge. It took millions of years to figure out how to do it, but it only took a second to produce it. But what happened in that moment that tool was created was transformative. At that moment, our ancestors, we think it was Australopithecus afarensis, created something that allowed them to overcome their physical limitations. What they created was an edge that was sharper and more durable than anything on their body. And they could use it, and if it broke or got dull, they could make another one in a second. So they literally began to out-eat their own digestive tract. And that tool is actually a butchering tool. We know for a fact that the same time those tools were created, we start finding bones of scavenged animals with butchering marks on the bones. They were actually accessing meat from lion kills, or actually, in that case, saber-toothed cat kills, and introducing meat into their diet. Transformative. And then things like fire and hunting technology, allowing us to take down animals at will from a distance, overcoming our physical limitations and things like boomerangs and throwing sticks and atlatls and bows and arrows and traps and nets and fishing hooks and all those kind of things. I mean, think about how transformative that kind of thing is in our diet. But to more specifically answer your question, a focus of my research for the past 20 plus years has been, how did our ancestors use technologies to take plant resources, detoxify them, make them safe to consume, and equally as important, take the nutrients that are in those plants and actually make them more accessible to our bodies. And that has been really, really interesting to me, especially today with those kind of, the polarizing conversations. Should we eat all meat? Should we eat vegetables? Plants are trying to kill us. I mean, there's so much information out there right now. Some of it's misinformation, but all of it's an important thing to consider.
Yeah, and I definitely want to dive into plants. But if I heard you right, there was a commensurate rise with the tool production and advanced tool production with the development of humans as we know to be today, with our brain development, with our intellectual capabilities, because we could then acquire nutrition from animals that would help us become more intellectual animals.
Right.
Is that
right? So our own digestive tract, I'm convinced of this, and there's some people who many people probably disagree. But if you look at other animals are perfectly designed. Wild animals are perfectly designed to consume the diets that they consume. Like they have whether it's the production of enzymes or different organs or pieces and parts of their digestive tract or the way their palate is formed or the shape of their teeth, they are perfectly designed to take a certain set of resources from the environment and safely and efficiently transform that into nutrition and to fuel their bodies. Humans don't have that. In fact, when we started creating tools, something really, really weird happened. And creating tools and using those tools to change our diets, our bodies and brains jumped in size. And both of those things require a massive influx of high-quality nutrition to fuel. A bigger body requires more nutrition and better nutrition. And more importantly, a bigger brain requires more and better nutrition as well. You would expect that as our bodies and our brains grew, every part of our anatomy that we have that allows us to take a raw material and transform it into its safest and most nourishing form should also get bigger or more efficient as well. And what we see is the exact opposite. We now have, our guts are 60% the size they should be for a similar sized primate. Our teeth, even though our heads have grown 3 times in size, our teeth have shrunk in size. So like everything we have physically that allows us to take these raw materials and turn them into nutrition is going away or getting smaller. And that seems weird. But then if you counter that understanding with what are we doing outside of our body before we consume our food? What are those stone tools being used for? What is fermentation being used for? What is cooking being used for? We are actually doing much of the digesting and preparation before the food touches our mouth. And that's one of the big differences between humans and other animals. So the one food that I truly believe humans are perfectly designed to consume, the single food, is breast milk from our mothers when we're infants. And then after we get weaned, we lose the ability to do that as safely and efficiently, right? So here we are left, after we've been weaned off our mothers, literally defenseless. Like here we are with these bodies and brains that require a massive influx of not only nutrition, but nutrition in the right state, with a body that isn't designed to consume almost everything that we consume. And we rest on these technologies. We absolutely require it. So if you look at our evolution through time, what we see is prior to the first stone tools, so prior to 3.5 million years ago, for sake of argument, everything we ate was just we were collective foragers. Everything we got, we had to use our fingers for, and all the digestion of it and detoxification and consumption, it happened inside of our bodies. So we were eating plants, we were eating fruits, and we were eating insects. Of the three, the least toxic, most nutrient-dense, bioavailable, and available almost the entire year would be the insects. And I mean, it isn't like, and please don't, anybody listening, don't like correlate this with walking through the produce section of the grocery store, your farmer's market. I mean, we're talking about people with no tech, or ancestors with no technologies in one area that by default are eating plants that are hyper-local and hyper-seasonal, right? And only the ones that they can't detoxify. So it's a very limited amount of those things, a whole influx of insects. So we're gatherers. We create this stone tool, allows us to be scavenger gatherers, right? We're scavenging the meat that's left over after a predator makes a kill, and after that predator has already devoured the most nutrient-dense bioavailable parts of that animal, which is the blood, the fat, and the organs. So when they go and digest that, there's flesh left hanging on the carcass that things like buzzards and hyenas go after, but now our ancestors are going after with stone tools. So go from gatherers to scavenger gatherers, and that happens at about 3.5 million years ago. And that stays the same for about 1.5 million years. And the biggest jump in brain size and body size in our evolutionary past happens at around 2 million years with the introduction of Homo erectus, or if we're splitting hairs, Homo ergaster as well, at 2 million years ago. And the difference is, there's two differences in their diets. The main one, and I think the most important, is we start hunting. And somebody will say, well, wait, they've already been eating meat for 1.5 million years. No, they've been scavenging meat for 1.5 million years. The difference with being a hunter compared to a scavenger is a hunter has first access to every part of that animal. And if part of this conversation is resting on nutrient density and bioavailability, meat is more nutrient dense and bioavailable than any plant on the planet. But it's one of the least nutrient dense bioavailable parts of an animal. Right, that's the blood, the fat, and the organs, right? Meat is incredibly important. I'm not downplaying it. But one of the things that we have to consider is when we start hunting, we can take an animal down at will. We're not waiting for a predator to kill it. And we have first access to every part of that animal. There's major differences across the board. And one of it is we see massive jump in body and brain size, almost to modern proportions. Wow. And the second thing that happens is we're also cooking. So we go from gatherers to scavenger gatherers to hunter gatherers. And then that persists for the entirety of that 2 million years. And the biggest difference is now, the biggest two changes in a negative way in most cases is, 12 to 15,000 years ago, we become food producers with the agricultural revolution. And during the Industrial Revolution, we become food consumers, most of us. And, we see a huge negative transitions in our diets as a result.
Which we're experiencing as the direct result of that with obesity, diabetes, early onset cancer, dementia, all of that. I definitely want to get more into vegetables, but let's talk about the blood, the organs, and the fat as being the most nutrient dense. And it turns out because you've also traveled the world. I mean, this is not just like reading books. I mean, you've been to all sorts of different countries, lived in these countries for extended periods of time with your family, and introduced them to traditional foods and cooking, which is phenomenal. It's all laid out in your book and what you do here at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen. We hear a lot about blue zones, and there's a big push to go on a plant-based diet, right? And you've been to these blue zone regions, and you've seen that, not too many vegetables are actually consumed there. Many of these people are consuming foods that would be not in the, not recommended by the health experts or preventing diabetes, cancer, and all this. But yet these people are very healthy, have a dearth of these different medical conditions. So let's talk about the organs and the blood. And you found these seem to be widely consumed by really healthy, long-living peoples.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to give an example of some time we spent in a village called Villa Grande. It's on the east coast of Sardinia, the first blue zone ever identified. It's the first one they talk about in the Netflix special about the blue zones. And I'll tell you about our experience. And this wasn't an experience that was fabricated for us. We were living with traditional Sardinians in this village, and we were doing some research over there. We were looking into fermented dairy. We were doing some cheese things, but we're also with a Sardinian food historian who is from this village. And everything we experienced, first of all, was beautiful. But this is what we experienced. Number one, when we arrived, so we had flown into an airport in the southern part of Sardinia as a family, spent the night there, and then we rented a car and drove to this village. And it was quite a trip, and it's all through the mountains on these single lane roads, and the kids were about to throw up. I mean, we got there, they were exhausted, we were jet lagged. I mean, everything that you could imagine. We finally get to this village, we get out of the car, and this woman who had been, it took me 10 years to set this research trip up, but this one, her name is Gisela Rubio. Yeah, she's a beautiful, amazing woman. She's written several books on Sardinian food. She spoke zero English and we spoke zero Italians, but we all just connected around food. She was so happy after months and months and months of communication. She runs out, gives us this hug, and we were at the house of the family we were staying with, and we're literally ready to roll out of the car and like maybe take a shower, but crash. And she's like, come, we walk. I'm like, what do you mean we walk? No, we walk. I'm like, okay. And the kids are like, no. Yep, we're walking. So we get out of the car, and it isn't, nothing's flat. I mean, it's all, we're on the side of a mountain. We're walking, and here's this, she's in her late 70s, early 80s, I'm sure. We just start walking and talking. And we walked for an hour up and down these mountains. And okay, so the first thing is they walk, and I mean they walk a lot. And we were passing people, and right when we started to understand more about who was in the village, I mean, there are people in their hundreds walking up and down these mountains every single day. I mean, it's just a fact of life. So that's number one. They walk and walk a lot. Number two, what I think you would expect to see in a place that has the oldest living, one of the oldest living populations in the world, according to modern standards, is you would expect to see, I think, a gym on every corner, a whole bunch of nutritionists, and a bunch of retirement homes, because you have all these old people, right? And in fact, we saw none of those things. We saw not one of those things. Nobody would have won a bodybuilding contest. But Brian Sanders and a lot of people, they post pictures of the beach, and here's a regular beach picture of from the 1940s, 1950s, and everybody's fit. I mean, it was that kind of body shapes that we saw regularly. So nobody's sitting there doing a ton of resistance training, but everybody is active. And I would say everybody was athletic. We didn't need any nutritionists because nobody had any questions about food. And we'll get to that part in a second, but everybody knew where their food came from. They were eating first of all, they were eating seasonally by default, and they were just eating according to what they had and their traditions of how they made it. They weren't sitting there asking, where does this come from, and how do I buy this, and what's this label supposed to look like, and how much grams of this am I supposed to eat? There was none of those questions because they were so connected to their food. And there were no retirement homes because it wasn't that they had this lifespan, they had this health span. The man living next door to the home that we were staying in was 102, I believe, something like that. And he lived on the second floor. He went up and down those steps every single day. Wow. Every single day, lived completely by himself. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that there isn't a whole bunch of diversity here and a lot of different things to consider, but everybody that we came in contact with was mentally there and physically there, no matter what their age were. And I picture their life like, and I mean this in a very positive way, like another wild animal, like an animal that I see. I want to emulate my life on what a wild animal's life is. They live this amazing life and then keel over dead. Mm-hmm. Like that's how I want to live. I don't want to die the last 30 years of my life. I want to live this amazing life, hopefully as long as I can, and then keel over dead. That's what we saw. The meals that we ate were so incredibly connected. One thing I pride myself on in our home and also in this restaurant is that there are no two ingredients put together outside of our walls. Like we literally make everything 100% from scratch here, partially because we can control the process that way. And we can make sure that things are fermented properly or butchered properly or cured properly or whatever it is. But it's very important to me for that. Plus, I know exactly where everything comes from, how it's all done. If a customer asks, I can tell them. But that's a fairly unique thing nowadays. Every single meal we ate in this village, no matter whose home we were in, was that connective. That actually even more connective because they didn't even go by the produce. Like they were raising their vegetables, raising their animals, butchering these. They were making their cheese. They were making their cured meats. They were making all of it. So there were no questions. It was a tight connection. The other thing that I think is super important to understand is that we ate a massive amount of animals, a massive amount, and the entire animal. It wasn't like a sitting there, a bunch of ribeyes, and I'm not picking on ribeyes. I love ribeye, but it wasn't like ribeye tonight, ribeye tomorrow, ribeye the next day. It was a diversity of animals and a diversity of animal parts. We had a lot of cured meats, a lot of cheeses, a lot of the entire animal. The second night we were there, they did this big, they called it a barbecue, but it was more like a big lamb on a spit, and right next to it was all the intestines wrapped up, and it was sitting there right next to it, and we ate the entire thing. Every house we went to, the first thing they did was pull out some of their homemade charcuterie, and when I say that, I mean things like their homemade salami and their cured meats and all of this, and then all their homemade cheeses. That's the first food that always got put in front of us everywhere. Every single day we had animal in our diet, and there were plants. Yes, there were some tomatoes, there were some olives, there was, believe it or not, some eggplants. And I'm sitting there talking about all these nightshades, but there was that. There was garlic, there was onions, there was basil, typically what you would expect for it. But that was it.
No big salads or anything.
No, there wasn't a salad around. None of it. And no meal we had, no time that we sat down and ate food was something from an animal absent on the table. So what I think is also interesting is sometimes, and so I'm sure there were a lot of reasons, some good, some probably bad, that led to the blue zones being portrayed the way they are. And I'm just giving you one snapshot of one of the blue zones, but I'm sure there are a lot of reasons. Certainly the message is, plants are going to save the world. We shouldn't be eating any animals. I mean, that's that overall message. In addition to anything intentional that was being done to sort of push the blue zone narrative in the direction that it's become, there's probably other things as well, and some of them might be very cultural. So, for example, at the end of our experience there, I was blown away by the amount of animal that we ate. Thrilled about it, but blown away. So I went to the head of the household that we were staying with, and I said, listen, and again, this is all through a translator, but I said, look, I don't understand. Like, how often do you eat meat? He said, once a week. I said, well, wait a minute. I've been with you for a week. I've had it not only every day, but every meal. Like, are you out of your mind? And he said, no, once a week. And I said, when would you have considered we ate meat then? And he said, on Sunday when we did the big barbecue. And I'm not suggesting that this is the reason why the entire narrative's become what it's become. But it was interesting that from a cultural perspective, when I said eating meat, it was akin to having a big, huge blowout barbecue. And the meat that's in their diet every single day was just regular routine thing. So he didn't consider all that charcuterie and all that cheese and all those other things that we ate as eating meat. He considered that big barbecue eating meat. And again, if all I said was, if I didn't know him, I walked up to him on the street and said, how often do you eat meat? He said, once a week. And I walked away. I said, I have my answer. But the reality is meat was in everything.
Well, and those meats actually are counter to the narrative, because we hear the worst meat is a processed meat, right? The salami, the deli meats and things like that. But how they are prepared in that environment is not, it's processed via fermentation, right? It's a natural processing, not with nitrates or other things that might be utilized here in the U.S. So how would you compare and contrast what the perception of these so-called processed meats from the reality of how they are actually prepared and what you do downstairs?
That's a great point. First of all, so one example I usually give with the idea of processing and processing of food, and this is, again, really important, I think, because one of the issues, just like the issue of how often you eat meat and the misunderstanding and the language and the communication, that can permeate all sorts of that sort of miscommunication, and the way that we use language, the way that we use words can be very problematic for how we perceive the world in different situations. So, for example, in this country, we use the same term fat for fat that we eat, dietary fat, and then for visceral fat. And then we say, okay, well, eating fat makes us fat, and it's very easy to make that link, but it's partially because of the way that we view that word fat, that word meat, right? So the word processing is equally as problematic. So many years ago when I was teaching at Washington College, this one semester, two of the classes I taught were focused on food. One class was all about food in prehistory, and one class was a more current cultural anthropological class where we're talking about modern food and modern food industries and all this. And in this semester, I happen to have a female student in both of those classes, taking them simultaneously. And 2 weeks into the semester, she came up to me. She said, "Hey, Professor Schindler, I need you to clarify something for me. Like, you use this word processing in both classes, food processing in both classes. And in the prehistoric class, you're super excited, you're giddy, you're smiling ear to ear, and you say food processing. In the other class, in the modern context, it looks like somebody ran over your dog, and you're all pissed off. Like, what's the difference?" And I looked at her, and it's like one of those situations. You knew there's a difference, but you can't put it into words. I said, I do what you're supposed to say in those situations. I will get back to you. And I did, but it took me 2 weeks to figure out, like, where do I draw the line? Mm-hmm. And this is where I draw the line. Most, and I don't want to say all, but most food processing in the past, where, again, we're using technologies to transform a raw material into something else before it goes into our bodies. Most food processing in the past was focused on three main goals: making food safe, nutrient-dense, and bioavailable. I mean, that's literally, and when it does it right, it does all three at the same time. And most of them do. Food processing today is focused on other goals. It's focused on shelf life, uniformity, being able to ship without bruising, making somebody a whole lot of money, cutting corners, that sort of thing, tweaking on our evolutionary senses so that we get, that Dorito effect, right? Mm-hmm. That's what it's focused on. And what's most problematic about it is not only is it focused on those goals, but The bigger problem is it's at the expense of things like safety, nutrient density, and bioavailability. So that's where I draw the line with food processing, and I think it really holds up. But I don't want somebody to hear processed food and immediately get that negative idea in their head, because in fact, we require it. There's two ways that humans get nutrition from the outside world. One is to let an animal that is perfectly designed biologically to consume something we have no business eating,
like grass,
or tough vegetable materials or whatever, and transform it in their digestive tract into something that we can easily derive incredible safe nutrition from, like meat, fat, blood, organs, whatever, and then consume that. Or we replicate that biological process that animal went through outside of our bodies and do it before we consume it. So, for example, instead of letting a cow use its rumen to ferment tough vegetable materials, we can take that, salt it, put it in a crock, ferment it ourselves, and then consume it. Those are the only two ways we can safely and efficiently derive nutrition from the outside world. So food processing is essential, but only when it's in that positive way.
So since you just mentioned vegetables, I think that's a great place to talk about. Do you ever have a salad, or are most of the vegetables that you eat fermented?
That is a really good question.
I don't eat salads, just for the audience, especially now with the oxalate concentration well known with spinach and Swiss chard. I mean, I used to grow these things, and when I was eating a lot of vegetables that I grew myself, I was really unhealthy. My GI tract was not happy. Just so.
I don't eat a whole lot of vegetables. Here's my disclaimer, because it is important for people to understand where we're coming from, because all of us are biased in everything that we say, whether we're going to be or not. So just so everybody sort of has the background first. Number one, I don't eat a whole lot of vegetables. I'm very selective about the ones that I do, and I make sure I put them through the processing necessary to, if they need to be, detoxified or transformed in some way to release their nutrients and make them available to my body. I had massive issues with oxalates in the past. I'm very sensitive to oxalates, both physically, but also mentally. I'm sensitive to it. I keep track of what I'm eating. I don't let anything in my diet that is in the high range for oxalates, and nothing in this restaurant or at our home is allowed that way. But that said, I do eat vegetables. I enjoy vegetables. I love Brussels sprouts. I mean, I love them. I love the texture. If they're cooked right, I love the smell. I love all of those things about something like Brussels sprouts. So people do make the case that, we know people in our community that would say we need absolutely no vegetables whatsoever, and that we're obligate carnivores. I don't think I entirely agree with that or that stance, but from a nutritional perspective, sometimes they have points. But we're very complex beings. Our relationship with food is equally as complex. In order to be a fully nourished human, as you know, meeting our nutritional needs is not the only goal. Like, we have to also meet our emotional needs and our cultural needs, and for some people, our religious needs or our political needs, right? All these things come together at the same time to create a fully nourished human. And whether it's because of a social context or just because of a memory from being a kid and having something, including a vegetable in our diet in a safe way can be incredibly nourishing, even if our body doesn't necessarily require it. Although I think in some cases they might. So, do I eat a salad? Rarely. And I never would eat a spinach salad. Salads, and my problem is, remember, I spent much of my life overweight, trying to lose weight, battling with this unhealthy relationship with food. And I was one of those people that I thought if I was going to get healthy, I had to eat a salad. Salads are one of the stupidest things ever hit the table. Like, they truly are. There's nothing there but air and water and potentially some toxins.
Well, and the dressing is corn oil, soy oil, or canola oil. So you're having junk and more junk. I mean, it's really incredible.
And then you still leave
hungry.
You're distended, but you're not satiated. Yeah. And then you feel it, and if you're not used to that level of fiber in your diet, you have issues the next day too. I mean, there's all sorts of issues with it. So dealing with vegetables the right way is incredibly important. And this, I know we can dive down rabbit holes, and I'm happy to do so, but I think I've been able to come up with a way to view plants from a kind of a macroscopic level that is useful to people, at least to sort of put this in context and not say, oh my gosh, this is way too complicated, I'm not even listening anymore. It's like, okay, think about it this way. I do agree with the notion that every single plant on this planet has some level of toxin in it. That isn't, we hear that word toxin, like, oh my gosh, toxins. Well, toxins. Some of them will kill us. Some of them will make us sick. Some of them will make us sick over time. Some of them we actually use as spices. Some of them we use as medicines. I mean, there's a full range of toxins, and the way they impact our body is specific to the context they're being used in, what they're being consumed with, how much is being consumed at a given time. What's the duration of there's all sorts of things that impact that. So they all have some level of toxin, not to scare us, but just to make us aware. And the reason plants have toxins is because they don't move and they're trying to protect themselves and produce the next generation of healthy plants. And this makes evolutionary sense. We all do this. Every organism does it at some level, but they do it through chemical warfare. Now, if you think about the different parts of a plant and the purposes they serve, and also plants aren't just trying to be evil. It takes energy for plants to produce these toxins. So you can bet that they're only being produced where they need to be produced and at the places in the concentrations that make the most sense for that plant. So, for example, underground storage organs, roots, corms, and tubers are a place that's very important to the plant, especially perennial plants like a potato, where they spend the entire summer building up these starch reserves so that when the top of the plant dies, the underground part of that plant feeds off of these starch reserves until the sun comes back, and then they can put the leaves out and start engaging in photosynthesis again. That's an incredibly important part of the plant. So not only do typically underground storage organs, roots, corms, and tubers, are they very toxic, but the outside layer, the skin of things like a potato, have a much higher concentration of toxins than on the inside, because that's the barrier for insects and disease and predators and that sort of thing. So there's that. Then we have like leaves and stems and that sort of thing, and that's hard to categorize because there's a lot of diversity in plants, but I will tell you that depending on the season and the plant, the level of toxin can vary quite a bit there. If you get to things like flowers, the role of a flower is to attract, right? Especially in plants that require pollination. So a flower is typically beautiful, colorful, pretty, it smells good, tastes good, and has typically a very low toxin level or absent in toxins because of the role that it serves the plant.
What would an example of that be in the human diet of flower? I mean, I know there are some edible flowers, but is that mostly insects that would eat that, or is there something I'm not thinking of that we might consume?
There's the crazy thing with flowers, and I think the reason that there's not more flowers in our diet is not because of a toxic reason, but because they're so ephemeral, like friable. You can't friable, not like put it in a fryer, but they it's hard to keep them fresh.
Right. Spring, they flower and then they're gone.
They flower, then they're gone. And remember, they are a precursor to something that typically is more important from a culinary sense later on. Like a flower then becomes a zucchini. A flower then becomes an eggplant. A flower then becomes a tomato, right? So it makes more economic sense and dietary sense to wait till it fruits and turns into whatever it's going to turn into, because you're stopping the production of that tomato if you take the tomato flower off.
Gotcha. So it's like, okay, hey, look, I'm pretty, take care of me so I will bear fruit later, maybe.
Exactly. But the fruit one I think is really interesting. The role of a fruit is to attract something that consumes mature seeds and then spreads those seeds, it deposits them. The seeds go through the digestive tract of the animal and gets deposited in a pile of manure somewhere else. I mean, it's like a perfect system. But that system, what everybody needs to understand is that system only works when the seeds are mature. So it doesn't make evolutionary sense for a fruit to attract an animal to eat it before those seeds are ready to be dispersed right. So typically, unripe fruits have a higher level of toxin than a ripe fruit, and in some cases a dangerous level. And this is not only wild fruits. This is even in our domesticated, fruits that are in the grocery store. A green banana has a much higher toxin load than a banana has, right?
Oxalates or just other
I don't know the exact numbers. Oxalates don't seem to be a huge issue there, but there are other toxins. A great example here are wild persimmons. If you've ever had a wild persimmon, there's a wild persimmon tree right on the corner. A ripe wild persimmon is literally one of my favorite fruits in the entire world. They're native to this area. They're fantastic. They've been eaten for thousands and thousands of years. A unripe persimmon, if you take the smallest bite of that, it's highly astringent, sucks all the water out of your mouth, and you don't eat anything for about a day and a half. I mean, it's that horrible. But the moment that seed is mature, the toxin gets switched off and it turns into this amazing lush fruit. So the fruit itself, fruits in general. Now, this isn't to suggest we should eat massive amounts of fruits, but from a toxic perspective, a ripe fruit is rarely toxic. And that is almost across the board. Ripe fruit. But a seed, a grain, a nut, or a legume, that's the next generation of the plant. Those are highly protected through all sorts of toxins. Another great example is another wild plant around here. It's the only one that has any relationship to tropical fruits, but it's native to this area. Is a pawpaw. When I say pawpaw, I don't mean a papaya. I mean an American pawpaw. It looks like a gorgeous, cool little green banana. They grow all over the place around here. A ripe pawpaw was George Washington's favorite fruit. He ate a chilled ripe pawpaw every night when it was in season. Amazing fruit. The seed has a powerful neurotoxin in it. And I one time processing pawpaws, nicked the seed, and I made this kind of pawpaw fruit leather. I've been eating pawpaws for many, many years. And I dehydrated it. I had a small piece about the size of my pinky nail, and Billy did too. And within an hour, the two of us were in 2 separate bathrooms, vomiting and diarrhea uncontrollably, massive headaches, and and then a few hours later, the symptoms seemed to disappear.
Because you blended it up in the fruit leather?
I was using a food mill, which is very typical, but I must have nicked the seed, and powerful neurotoxin. So here you have this amazing fruit, and then you have the seed. The seed is not there for us to digest. A grain is not there for us to digest. None of those things. A legume, none of those are babies, right? For in the plant world. So especially things like sourdough bread, baked beans, corn, all of those things, if we are going to take that and try to derive nutrition from them safely, we have got to put them through traditional processing methods to make them safe and make those nutrients available to our bodies.
Yeah, I love that. I think this aspect of plant-based nutrition does not get enough airtime, especially from the mainstream media, from the politicians or policymakers who suggest a plant-dominant diet. It's like everything is great. Eat the fruit, even throw the whole apple with all the seeds or the kiwi fruit in a blender, and better yet, make a smoothie, right? And we know there's inherent problems there. And that's what I love about what you do here. It's not that you're anti-plant, it's that you prepare things in such a way so that to minimize, we'll do several things like you talked about, maximize the nutrients and bioavailability while minimize the plant toxins.
Absolutely.
So starting with just nesquamization. I always screw that
so
one up.
close. Nixtamalization.
Nixtamalization, yes, with maize or corn. Let's talk about that. And then beans, because we had chili yesterday, refried beans. I normally don't eat beans because I don't want to, I'm too lazy when it comes to that to soak them overnight in alkaline material. But I think a lot of people are like, well, I eat this plant-based diet, but I have all these GI issues because they're not taking these steps. So maybe let's talk about maize and legumes and how to prepare them.
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. It's not getting talked about enough. And I will say that no matter what dietary path you're on, whether you're carnivore, keto, vegetarian, vegan, pescatarian, whatever new thing comes up, I can promise you that whatever it is you're on, if you transform a little bit of the processing, you can make that diet, without changing anything else, you can make that diet a little bit more safe and make the nutrients in it a little bit more available to your bodies, and it's a win-win across the board. So these, especially in the plant world. So let's do maize very quickly, and I'll tell a very quick story to sort of maybe ground this, and it's my poster child story for plant processing. So maize was domesticated. There's some controversy, but at least 10,000, potentially up to 15,000 years ago in the Balsas Valley of Mexico. And the original plant that it was domesticated from was a plant called teosinte, which is just a grass. I mean, it's so nondescript. We still wonder why anybody ever paid attention to it. If you just let your lawn go and don't mow it all summer, it would look very much like some of the stuff that would come up in your lawn. It's that nondescript. The cool thing about maize is that in just a few genetic mutations, it turns into what we have today. Like, it didn't take a whole lot of messing with to get it there. So it was very easy to manipulate. And even prehistorically, they were in such control of being able to use selective pressure to genetically modify it. They can control color, they can control grain size. One of the cool things that they did was, just like most grasses, the individual grains were encased in their own husk, and even corn. And I can show you an example after we're done. But one of the genetic mutations made it such that every grain wasn't in their own husk, all of a sudden there was a husk around the entire ear of corn, which makes obviously processing a hell of a lot easier. But so maize was domesticated a very long time ago and became the staple in so many diets across the Americas. And when I say staple, I mean like with the Aztecs, for example, it wasn't that they ate a little bit of maize. Like they ate a massive amount of maize. It was a staple food for them, and it became central to their art, their religion, their commerce, their diet, everything. Maize was, a huge part of their life. And Aztecs are around for a long time. It spreads throughout the Americas. All this is, happening. And then all of a sudden we have early colonization about 500 years ago. And when the colonists came over, they saw the maize. They tasted, it was already on the East Coast by then. They tasted the maize like, wow, this tastes good. It's super easy to grow. It's filling. We're going to bring it back to Europe. And they did. They brought it back to Europe. And look, our latitudes are in very similar ways. So things that grow in America, grow very easily in Europe as well. They brought it back, and it starts to spread throughout Europe. And what we see is we can follow how maize spread through Europe with the development of a disease that the world had never seen before called pellagra. And it first appears, it's first identified in Spain, and then it's identified in Italy where it gets its name pellagra, which means sour skin, which refers to one of the early stage symptoms of pellagra. So first you'd get this red rashy skin, then you would have things like falling off. It was sometimes actually confused with leprosy in the early stages. Then you would bleed. Your gums would bleed a lot. You'd have an aversion to sunlight. You'd eventually go blind, and then, if left undealt with, eventually die. Wow. We see it spread throughout Europe. It ends up in Eastern Europe around the same time that authors are starting to write about vampires. And there's some link. They're thinking, wait, maybe this is just a way of explaining something you never saw before. And you think about it, bleeding from the mouth, aversion to sunlight. Maybe there's some links. That's maybe a stretch. I don't know, but I thought I'd throw it in there. And the next time we see it outside of this country is in Ireland at the end of the Irish potato famine, where America's sending massive amounts of maize to Ireland as famine relief food. And the people who had access to that were no longer dying from starvation, but they were getting sick and dying of something they never saw before. It was very, very weird. And then it shows up here in America for the first time in the early 20th century, in the 1920s and 1930s, where over a period of 10, 15 years, we have millions of Americans getting sick and hundreds of thousands dying from this disease. And it turns out, after years of study, that it was because of a niacin deficiency in the diet. And the people that were suffering from this were typically families that were very, very poor, and the only thing they were eating was maize. But prior to maize entering their diet, they didn't have enough to eat, but they were getting their resources from different places, so they got all sorts of nutrients, including niacin in their diet. But when they started eating maize solely, exclusively, they were getting sick and dying from this disease called pellagra. And when in 1936, they identified that it was, in fact, a niacin deficiency. And because of that, the knee-jerk reaction, and think about what's happening in the 1920s and 1930s, our food in this country was, we think about our food now being bad. It was the 1930s is when everything started getting fortified. We started iodizing salt in the Midwest because people were getting goiters, and all of vitamin B was getting fortified. We were putting A and D in milk. We were doing all these things because the diets were so poor. But the knee-jerk reaction was all baked goods are going to get fortified with niacin. So if you go buy your Hawaiian rolls at the grocery store now and it says fortified with niacin on the bottom, the reason started in 1936 was a knee-jerk reaction of this. And you know what? What happened? People stopped dying and getting sick from pellagra. But that's not the end of the story. Why, for 15,000 years, did Native Americans eat massive amounts of maize, massive amounts of it with no ill effects, but starting about 500 years ago when that grain was brought to Europe and then came back to America, did we have so many people getting sick? The punchline is everybody that was eating massive amounts of maize and getting sick from a niacin deficiency was consuming massive amounts of niacin. It's in the maize. It's just bound up and unavailable to our bodies. So they were getting sick and dying. And I mean millions of people getting sick, hundreds of thousands dying, massive suffering across the world for hundreds of years from people who were eating a food that contained the nutrient that they were deficient in. That was causing the issue. So what the difference is, the problem was the Europeans took the corn, took the maize, and didn't take the technology. So Native Americans would nixtamalize the maize, which is a very simple process. It was originally done with wood ash, which is alkaline. But now it's done with cal or calcium hydroxide, or also sometimes on a massive scale, like Goya or somebody would use probably lye, all alkaline. You take the maize, the dried kernels. When I say maize, I'm referring to what you would grind up to make cornmeal, or what you would make grits out of, or if you're a hunter, the deer corn you would buy, that kind of maize. You take those kernels and you put them in water. You put a little bit of either wood ash or calcium hydroxide, or lye in that. Bring it to a simmer it for about 30 minutes, turn off the heat, and that's all you need to do. The next day, what you're looking at in that pot is a completely different food, and all the niacin, including other nutrients, are available to your bodies. If you use calcium hydroxide, there's calcium now there that's bioavailable, and they've changed the protein structure to make it more usable for our body as well.
Wow. So they took the food without the preparatory steps. They missed a major step, and in so doing that, harmed the lives of many, many people. And I think we can use that same analogy with maize. I love where you were going with that, with pellagra, with wheat in general. And so the fermentation process, maybe we don't dive into too many details, because we filmed about 6 or 7 videos yesterday that I'll link in this podcast that are really essential as a follow-up to this. But that, in my estimation, is, the lack of fermentation of wheat is why we see so many people ascribe health challenges with consumption of wheat, because it's very similar to maize, not undergoing a specialized process versus not. And maybe we can just speak high level of how the fermentation can change grains into making the anti-nutrients lower and bioavailability of nutrients higher.
To preempt that, there is no grain, nut, seed, or legume that should ever be consumed ever by a human without some level of processing, period. You are talking about the next generation of a plant, and these plants are putting all sorts of effort, chemical effort, into ensuring that the next generation is not going to nourish us, but it's going to make baby plants. Right? That's the job. So every single nut, grain, seed, or legume we ever consume has to be processed and processed properly. And it depends on the grain, it depends on the nut, it depends on what the toxins are. But in general, that means soaking, sprouting, nixtamalizing, and or fermenting. And in the case of things like wheat, what we're talking about here, one of the best ways to go about transforming a gluten-containing grain, or grain in general, into something that's safer and more nourishing is through the sourdough fermentation. So there's a lot of different ways of fermenting. You can use yeast fermentation. You can use lactic acid bacteria that ferment and produce lactic acid, and the pH drops. You can do something like nixtamalization, where it's more alkaline and the alkalinity rises because of the process. But there's all types of different fermentation. With wheat and grains in general, we're talking about using lactobacillus bacteria, lactic acid bacteria, to eat the available sugars, produce lactic acid, engage in fermentation that is chemically and physically changing that grain, including the gluten, and also transforming the anti-nutrients on the outside of that grain into something that's more digestible and more nourishing and safer for our bodies.
So important. I mean, we hear so much about, especially once fat was vilified in about 60 years ago, we need more whole grains. But no one said we need more fermented whole grains, although biblical texts and scripture talk about the importance of eat bread so long as it's been fermented. I can't remember when that was written, but 1,000 years ago or something. So really important stuff that I think most people don't realize. And then when they start fermenting grains at home and consuming them, the normally ascribed health effects associated with consuming gluten-containing grains are not there. Headaches, fatigue, belly aches, things like that. So, and that's what your restaurant, and you speak a lot about this in the book. Mm-hmm. And, as we have about 10 minutes before we have to head out. I think this is just really important for people to understand and conceptualize, and start to seek out in their own lives. But it turns out that baker's yeast was one of the main reasons. The advent of baker's yeast was kind of put the brakes on the natural fermentation process, right? Because it's just so much more efficient if you're doing any sort of grain-based production, that you just, instead of relying upon the 3-4 hour fermentation, you just throw in some yeast and go about your day.
It's people use, nowadays people use commercial yeast because that's all they've ever known, or that's all when you how to make bread. That's the recipe that comes up on the internet or in whatever cookbook that they have. There are some advantages to potential short-term advantages to using yeast that you purchase in the grocery store. One is it's very forgiving. Like you can go buy that packet of yeast, keep it in your freezer, decide on a dime that you want bread that night, mix it in, and you have bread in several hours, right? You don't have to babysit trillions of wild yeast and bacteria and take care of it, right? It's very uniform. I mean, they have it down. They understand. There's all types of different yeast. There's different strains of yeast for different things. If I wanted to make a straight yeasted bread or a straight yeasted like brioche or a pastry that's heavy with sugars and butters, I grab a different yeast, and I know exactly, they have it down. I know this hour this happens, this hour this happens. I just literally have to follow. I can turn my brain off and follow directions and be very successful in making whatever product I want to make. But what's weird about it, and it sounds traditional and historic, and that's how my grandmother did it. But if your view of history and prehistory is only 100 years old, it seems very old. When your view is more like mine from an archaeological sense, or my view of history or prehistory is millions of years, the amount of time that we've been using commercial yeast made in a lab is only about 150, 160 years. So it's very new. Mm-hmm. And when we isolate just that yeast, we lose a lot. And it's very, I think, indicative, or it mirrors a lot of things that have happened in our food system over the past several thousand years in some cases, that one of the things that happened is we've taken it out of context. Mm. Number one, we've taken just a few strains of yeast or a strain of yeast away from a family of yeast that have been living together for potentially millennia, and just isolated it. And we have to keep some of these things going in a lab, because if we let them go too long by themselves, they actually kill themselves off. They create a very hostile environment for themselves. So I think that's sort of weird as well. But the second thing is we've taken the yeast away from its natural symbiotic relationship with bacteria. So sourdough bread, true sourdough bread, has two simultaneous fermentations happening. One is bacterial, one is yeast. If you just take flour and water and mix it together, that will spontaneously happen on its own. If you take barley and you're making beer and it's a natural fermentation, it's a sour beer. It's bacteria and yeast working together on the available sugars and creating beer. This is a very natural symbiotic process that's producing something that, to me, makes a lot more sense. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we lose is connection. Yeah. I mean, there's a different level, and this isn't to downplay somebody that's baking bread for their family with commercial yeast. That's valuable. I mean, making that over buying something is a huge step. So I'm not downplaying it, but your connection to the flours, the bread, the traditional bread making process, and most importantly, your wild environment around you in your kitchen is completely different as a sourdough baker than it is as a baker that's using commercial yeast. So if you want that, one of the most important things I think anybody can ever do is start to remove links from their food chain. Mm-hmm. And if you're looking for that connection, then one way to do it is to dive into sourdough bread, as opposed to getting the bread machine and putting in the yeast and the flour and walking away and having some level of bread a couple hours later.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's changed my life and my family. Your book, Eat Like a Human. And I think starting out, sourdough bread making can be a little bit intimidating. So we started out with the pizza and pancakes. And who doesn't like a nice pancake, especially knowing that the grain has been fermented. Mm-hmm. And once you get to know the mother culture by way of making the pancakes, then you can get a little bit more comfortable with the bread making. So highly encourage people to check out your website. That's modernstoneagekitchen.com. Is that where you're?
modernstoneage.com
Modern Stone
is the website. And on social media, at The Modern Stone Age, and at Dr. Bill Schindler, at Dr. Bill Schindler.
Amazing. Because you do classes in person here just outside of DC.
We do a ton of in-person classes here in our nonprofit, the Food Lab, and we have also on our website, you can see all sorts of pre-recorded classes, and we also do live virtual classes as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, and the kitchen, do you think people come here knowing that every single grain, legume, nut, seed has been prepared in this way? Is that why most people seek you out, or they just love the taste?
People who are traveling a far distance to come to us have either heard a podcast, saw us on social media, something that alerted them to the fact that we do that. So they're taking a very long trip in order to come here and eat that way and have food prepared for them in that way. But a large number of local people that come in don't know that. And at first, it used to make me upset. Like we're missing something with our advertising. Like we need to be shouting this, out to the world. But at the same time, what I love is the fact that here we are traditionally preparing food, doing it the right way, completely from scratch, and people are comparing that food and choosing that food purely based on flavor and texture and aroma and all those other things that people use. And so we're not just making healthy food. We're making healthy food that's also delicious and has the right texture and it has the right look as well, which I'm really, really proud of. It used to make me upset, but now I'm incredibly proud about it.
It's amazing. I mean, everything is fermented, even to the croissants and the pastry items, which taste phenomenal. And I think you're one of 2 restaurants in the country that are actually making true sourdough pastries.
There may be others I don't know of, but I do know one other one that's truly making every single thing that they put out that has flour in it through a traditional sourdough process.
In Arizona? I think that's Proof.
Proof.
Yeah,
Proof bread.
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, I would encourage a lot of people to seek this out, vote with their dollar. Go to your restaurant, go to Proof, whatever. I mean, this is how food used to be made. We should be encouraging this, and that's why I strongly promote your book.
Thank you.
And your work. So, Bill, really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much. We do have another event that we have to get to momentarily, but just want to make sure that everyone listening knows that we filmed it's like 6 or 7 videos yesterday, all about sourdough, maintaining your mother culture, folding techniques, all of that. So if you're interested in that, in the description below this video and in iTunes, I'll have links to those videos. So people should definitely check that out and get out to Modern Stone Age Kitchen if you're outside of DC. It's an amazing experience.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Will.